The Technology History Podcast. Exciting stories about the development of technology by Christian Steinbach. Hi everybody, and welcome to episode number 4 in English of my Technology History Podcast. The title is The Space Shuttle, the First Successes and the First Tragedy. In the last episode, I reported on the conception and development of the American Space Shuttle in the 1970s. If you haven't heard this episode yet, I would recommend listening to this first. Today, I would like to continue with the first space flights with this then completely new spacecraft in the 1980s. And now, let's go. On 4/12/1981, the time had finally come. After many developmental delays and some launch postponements, the Space Shuttle Columbia was ready for the first space flight according to the new concept that the Americans would stick to for 3 decades. In contrast to previous disposable rockets, the Space Shuttle was supposed to launch into space with the help of its own engines, 2 additional rockets, and an additional tank, spend a few days there, and then land like a glider. As already described in the last episode, the risk for the 2-person crew was enormous, not least because it was not possible to initially test the Space Shuttle unmanned under space conditions. John Young was nominated as commander. He had already been in space 4 times, flown to the moon twice, and even set foot on it as commander of Apollo 16. His pilot, Robert Crippen, on the other hand, was supposed to travel into space for the first time with the Columbia after having worked as an astronaut in support teams for NASA for many years. The public interest in this launch of a space shuttle was huge, and, similar to the days of the moon flights, many spectators lined the streets around the spaceport in Cape Canaveral in Florida, finally bringing the local restaurant owners high income again. At 7 o'clock in the morning, after the Columbia 3 main engines, the 2 booster rockets were ignited and the Columbia lifted off from launch pad 39A in an infernal spectacle. 10 years later, I had the opportunity of making a tour of Florida. As part of it, I also visited Launch Complex 39A, from which a space shuttle had taken off only a few days earlier. And I was very impressed by the burn marks that the launch had caused, even at a great distance. But back to the first takeoff of the Columbia. The vehicle majestically left the ramp and climbed more and more quickly into the Florida sky on its exhaust trail. Since the spectators had to watch the spectacle from several kilometers away for safety reasons, it took a moment for the sound and pressure wave to reach them. But then they witnessed the elemental force that was developed by the shuttle system. To give an impression of this, here is the sound from a later launch made available by NASA for publication. Moments after liftoff, the ascent path turned into an arc. The combination of booster rockets, auxiliary tank, and space shuttle rotated and tilted slightly so that Columbia appeared to be hanging upside down. This arc became increasingly shallow as the ascent progressed and then transitioned into horizontal orbit around the Earth. After about a minute, the Columbia had already reached the speed of sound. After another minute, the 2 booster rockets burned out and were blown off. They fell into the sea on parachutes and were recovered for reuse. For a few more minutes, only the 3 main engines of the shuttle continued to drive the Columbia, fed from the additional tank. Finally, these were switched off and the additional tank was also blown off. It was the only major component in the shuttle concept that was not intended to be reused. And then the time had finally come. For the first time, a space shuttle had reached space. The two astronauts began testing the various systems. However, excitement arose after the large flaps of the loading bay were opened. The astronauts, who were now able to take a look at the rear of the space shuttle, realized that some heat protection tiles had been lost. I already spoke in detail about the topic of the heat protection and the major problems the engineers had with it in the last episode. Now the concern was again present that the Columbia could burn up like a shooting star when it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere due to a damaged heat protection. Using high-resolution telescopic cameras, the Columbia was searched from the ground for further damage. But the engineers came to the conclusion that the damage should not be critical. After 2 days, the first test flight of a space shuttle was over. Young and Crippen fired the maneuvering system's engines, causing the Columbia to lose speed and altitude, enter denser layers of air, and begin to glow from the high air friction. That was a critical moment. Would the heat protection survive, and with it the Columbia and its crew? But everything went well. The Columbia made a picture-perfect landing on the dry Salt Lake near Edwards in California and was greeted with cheers by numerous spectators. The first spaceflight of a reusable spacecraft was over. Now the big question was, would Columbia survive its second flight and thus the first reuse of a spacecraft? Astronauts Joe Engl and Richard Truly were supposed to answer this question. It was the first space flight for both of them. They launched on 11/12/1981 and tested the robotic arm in space for the first time. It had been developed in Canada and was intended, for example, to release and capture payloads. Things became critical, however, when one or three fuel cells failed. It generated electricity from hydrogen and oxygen, and even drinking water as a waste product. Therefore, to be on the safe side, the mission was aborted and Engl and Truly returned after 2 days instead of 5. Nevertheless, the feasibility was proven. For the first time, a spacecraft had flown into space twice. 2 more test flights followed, each with only 2 astronauts on board. Then NASA was ready to send Columbia on a regular mission with 4 astronauts at once for the first time. 2 satellites were released in late 1982. Mission number 6 was also the first of the second space shuttle Challenger. The shuttle flight slowly became routine for NASA. 2 more shuttles were built. The Discovery completed its maiden flight in 1984, followed by the Atlantis in 1985. The 4 space shuttles carried out a wide variety of missions. They launched satellites into space. They captured satellites with a robotic arm and released them after repairs. They launched the German-developed Space Laboratory for Scientific Experiments called Spacelab into space and carried out secret missions for the military. In the German D1 mission, a mission with the Spacelab and 2 German astronauts, there were even 8 astronauts on board. In 1985 and 1986, 10 missions were flown within 1 year. Most missions in the first half of the decade were successful. Only flight number 24 with the Columbia went down in history as a mishap flight. This went so far that even the Challenger was prepared for a rescue operation, which, however, did not have to be carried out. After the Columbia finally landed safely, everyone at NASA was sure that everything would be better on the next flight number 25. The anniversary flight number 25 with the Challenger was scheduled to take off on 1/28/1986, after several postponements. It was staged with particular publicity. Part of the crew was the teacher Krista McAuliffe, who was supposed to give a school lesson from space. But it didn't get that far. 73 seconds after launch, the space shuttle disintegrated in a massive fireball. It took the many spectators a moment to realize what had happened. But then the horror was enormous. It was clear to everyone that the 7 astronauts had no chance of survival. Here's an excerpt from the speech of the clearly shocked President Ronald Reagan.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country.
What was the Challenger's undoing? And would the Space Shuttle program ever recover from this tragedy? I will report on this in the next episode. With this, I conclude episode number 4 in English of the Technology History podcast about the first missions of the Space Shuttle. If you enjoyed the podcast, I would be very happy about a subscription. And maybe you know someone who is also interested in this topic and to whom you would like to recommend my podcast. Finally, my thanks go to walk-in music from Pixabay, whose song I was allowed to incorporate into the intro. Thank you for your interest and see you next time on the Technology History podcast.